All right. Hey, everybody. I am just taking a little break. I am in the middle of an academic conference right now, but I wanted to make a quick stop and take a video that was responding to some of the questions that have been accumulating over the last few videos. It was suggested that we separate out the questions from the rest, and we're also planning on adjusting our format a bit according to some of the feedback we've gotten. So I have some questions that I'll go through, and I'll try to answer as best I can, and feel free to let me know if you want more clarification. So the first one has to do with giants. So, and it's from Junkin Hick, and it is regarding giants. He commented previously on the link to gigantes, which are Greek, and have the same issue of not necessarily being gigantic, but this interesting idea of equating evil, great evils with greater size. And a question of functionally whether it only matters who the father is when calling them a god or not. So this is a really good question. And I like that observation a lot, this idea of equating greater evil with greater size. So when you're talking about, whether someone's a god or not, and what that has to do with parentage, you wouldn't really have a situation where a male giant procreates or marries a goddess. And in fact, that is kind of a major conflict within the mythology, that you'll have that kind of attempt. And that is when the gods are at the most risk, is when the giants or the Jötnar are attempting to marry Freya, Sif, Idun, or one of the goddesses. Because what's happening there is it's challenging the social hierarchy. So it's okay for the male gods to take concubines and wives from the giantesses, because it is they're kind of below them on the social hierarchy. But if it were to go the other way around, that would invert the social hierarchy, if that makes sense. So some of the biggest threats to the gods come when the giants come close to actually being successful in either mating with or marrying a goddess, because their success in doing so would signal like an inversion of this hierarchy. But kind of a short answer is yes, it does basically just boils down to who the father is. So for example, Loki is one of the Jötnar because his father, Farbauti, is a Jötun. And that is, I think, a good segue into some questions from Godzilla, which included one about Farbauti. So there were a few parts to the question from this individual. So I'll start with the one about Farbauti. So the one about how Farbauti means anger striker. Yes, so it means anger striker, and we know from Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda, written in the first half of the 13th century, one of our main sources for Norse mythology. We know this because Loki is introduced as being the son of Farbauti, anger striker. So John Lindau, and I'll come back to him in a little bit, he talks about how Loki's animosity towards the Aesir might be explained because of his relationship to the Jötnar and being basically of the Jötnar because his father is a Jötun. So because he's one, because his father is one. So that kind of idea of the group that you belong to being patrilineal. A couple other parts of the questions from this user, Thor. Yeah, you were absolutely right here. If I said beautiful, I take that back completely. I don't ever think of Thor really as beautiful. Baldur's the one you sort of think of as beautiful. I always think of Thor as kind of like a brute. He's described as being, kind of, the strong guy, big red beard. And one of his by names is, he's kind of known as Old Redbeard. But he is popular among humans, so maybe not necessarily like beautiful, but popular among humans. And he's the god of the everyday person, in contrast to like Odin, who is the god of the aristocracy, but absolutely kind of depicted as a brute. Then the other questions had to do with Freyr. And Freyr and the story of how he lost his sword, and also about the Aesir burning him. So sometimes I'm going to say Aesir because that's just the anglicized version. Sometimes I'll do the proper pronunciation of Aesir. I'm not going to be consistent. That's just how it is. Anyway, so Freyr is Freya's brother. They're both they're twins, gods and goddesses of fertility. Freya is responsible for kind of like reproductive fertility, love, things like that. And there's, as has been noted quite a lot, and as this game picks up on as well, it's possible that Freya and Frigg were actually different names for the same goddess. So in the mythology, Freyr does not give up his sword to Odin. He gives it up to his servant Skirnir because he falls in love with a giantess named Gerður. And he sees her from afar and he becomes so lovesick that he can't do anything. So he sends his servant Skirnir to attempt to get the giantess to marry him. And he sends along with him his sword, which has been interpreted in all kinds of ways by scholars. So Skirnir travels down to Jötnaheimur to attempt to woo Gerður. And it's actually a really horrifying myth because he basically threatens Gerður until she agrees to marry Freyr. And getting back to the idea of how the gods can marry giantesses, there's a hierarchy among the gods as well. So the Aesir are the tribe of gods that won the Aesir Vanir war at the beginning of time. And the Vanir are kind of like this subgroup, and belonging to them are Njörður and his children, Freyr and Freya. And I think some sources also say that Heimdall was one of the Vanir, but that's not consistent. But we know for sure Njörður and Freyr and Freya. And they have kind of a subordinate status among the Aesir, and it's been noted that this is sort of indicated also by the fact that they are the only ones who marry giantesses. The Aesir marry other Aesir, whereas the Vanir have to they have to find their spouses among the Jötnar. So that's just been observed as sort of signaling their status among the Aesir. But speaking of that war, that kind of gets to the final part of your question about burning Freyr. So in Ragnarok, Freyr is killed by Surtur, who is like a fire demon, a Jötun, who, that's who he faces off with. It makes sense symbolically as well, like Freyr, agricultural, fertility and abundance. Fire destroys that. Makes sense. There's indications that Freya was burned by the Aesir at the initial Aesir-Vanir war, because there are kind of these, it's in the Severus's prophecy. There's a stanza where it talks about the burning of a goddess named Gulveig or Heiður, and it's thought that was Freya. So that's where that probably comes from. All right, so I'm just looking at my notes here too. I'll go to the one about recommendations for further reading. So you've heard me mention a few times the Prose Edda by Snorri Sturluson. That is kind of one of our main primary sources for our understanding of Norse mythology. And there are some, great recent translations of that, fairly accessible. And it's written, as the title suggests, in prose. So in kind of regular, of how you read a novel, for example. It's told in story form, written by Snorri Sturluson, who was a very important figure in 13th century Iceland. And one of his main sources is kind of the other main source for us as well for Norse mythology, and that's the Poetic Edda. And that's another 13th century, it's from a 13th century manuscript, and the poetry in it is thought to be, some of it thought to be fairly contemporary with the manuscript, some of it thought to be older, but it contains a number of poems having to do with the gods as well as heroes who are associated with the gods in some way. So those are a couple of the main primary sources. And the Poetic Edda, so it's been translated a number of times. The translations I can recommend are Carolyn Larrington's, which is the one that was done with Oxford. It's been kind of like the standard translation. It's probably the easiest to find inexpensive copies of, but I can also highly recommend Jackson Crawford's translation of the Poetic Edda. Jackson and I were in grad school together, and if you want to see on my channel, I've pinned some videos as well, where I've gone onto his channel and we've talked about some things. So we were PhD students together, good friend of mine, great person, and he did a great translation of the Poetic Edda, as well as a number of other works. And if you're looking for kind of a guide to Norse mythology, I always recommend, and I use this in my classes as well, Professor John Lindau, who was a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and is sort of one of the leading scholars of Norse mythology. He wrote Norse Mythology, a guide to the gods, heroes, rituals, and beliefs, I believe is the title, but I'll show an image here as well, so you can see what it looks like. And it's fantastic. It's basically just like, it's a reference book, and it has an entry for every single one of these, gods, myths, places, heroes, and a great introduction as well that sort of contextualizes all of it. So you can go to, for example, an entry on Fárbæti, Loki's father, and it's going to tell you every single instance in the primary sources in which he is mentioned, and what we know about him based on the sources that have survived. Carolyn Larrington has also written a number of books as well, and she has some recent ones out that you might want to check out. And yeah, she's also is going to be, I think, giving a masterclass on Norse mythology. So she was one of the kind of the main translators of the Poetic Edda, and is another leading authority on Norse mythology. So lots of great stuff out there. And last but not least are Jackson Crawford's videos. So Jackson is fantastic. He really knows his stuff. So head over to his YouTube channel and check out what he's done. He gives lessons in Old Norse. You'll notice his pronunciation is different from mine. There's kind of two schools, and neither one is not like a weird rivalry or something, but he pronounces Old Norse using kind of a reconstructed pronunciation based on certain sources that tell us how the words might have sounded. I use a modern Icelandic pronunciation, which is kind of the other way. It's purely practical for my sake because I also speak modern Icelandic, and it helps me not get confused in that way. So when you hear me pronouncing Old Norse words, it's in a modern Icelandic pronunciation, which is kind of also another way of doing it. So you'll see two schools of which is interesting because we went to grad school together, but it's personal preference entirely, and no one way is better than the other. It's not like we have this, major rivalry or something, but just if, you notice some inconsistencies with my pronunciation and with his. And like I said, sometimes I'm going to anglicize things. And yeah, I got called out in a video for being inconsistent with my pronunciation, but it is what it is. And I'll just do my best. And yeah, so onward we go. So that is the recommendations for further reading. There's a great question about instances of people from other lands being mentioned in Norse mythology. So this is really an interesting question because it's kind of the whole premise of Snorri Sturluson's prose Edda, and it's how he explains the origins of the Norse gods, which he's doing from a 13th century Christian perspective. So he's writing down Norse mythology over 200 years after Christianity has taken effect in Iceland. And he kind of prefaces his account of Norse mythology with this explanation of how the gods were actually historical figures, and that the historical Thor and Odin came from Troy, and they made their way up to Sweden, and the people there who had kind of forgotten, basically, he has this idea about how after Noah's flood, people forgot about who the Christian God was, and they started to make up stories about how the world worked and why things were the way they were. And they encountered these individuals from Troy, thought them to be associated with all kinds of great things, and started to worship them as gods. So that's how he explains. That's how he explains the origin of Norse gods, and how he kind of, as a Christian author, gets away with doing that. And he also kind of absolves his ancestors. So like they just forgot who the Christian God was. They didn't know any better. They weren't, knowingly denying what Snorri and his context would have understood to be the one truth. And absolutely, people from other lands mentioned in some kind of adjacent literature to Norse mythology. A lot of the legendary literature mentions continental Europe quite a bit, and as well as other kind of known lands at the time. But I think the most direct link, and the one that I think is maybe most interesting for God of War, is this idea of the gods being basically Trojan warriors who made their way to Sweden and made the people from the north think that they were gods. All right. And I think the last one has to do with the difference between the relationship between Thor and Odin in mythology and in other forms of media. Okay, so like Marvel and God of War. I haven't seen too much yet in God of War, so I don't know if I can speak quite as much to that, but I can talk about the Marvel universe. And at least in that one, I mean, he's very much like a father figure, and he teaches Thor some hard lessons. You know, he banishes him to Earth, and Thor's looking for his approval and all of that stuff. It's not quite the same in the original source material. There's kind of a competition, a competitive nature between the two of them, much less sort of a father teaches son a lesson thing as we have going on in Marvel. So there's a couple sources. There's one where Thor is in a duel with a giant that Odin had managed to upset, and Thor cleans up a mess that Odin makes, and he slights him by giving this horse that he kind of obtains by as a result of winning the duel to his son instead of Odin. And then there's another poem called Halvard's Song, and this is where Odin is kind of disguised as a ferryman, and he encounters Thor, and there's kind of this exchanging of boasts and insults. And Odin basically just makes fun of Thor a whole bunch. And John Linda, who I mentioned earlier, talks about how in this poem, Odin establishes himself as being, you know, kind of his superiority over Thor in this poem in terms of wisdom. And that's not super hard to do. Thor is not well known for being a very bright figure. Which I think is what makes his pairing with Loki so interesting. Yeah, I think that might be all for now. It's possible that I missed some, in which case I'll do another one. I'll do another one anyway. Keep the questions coming, and I'll try to answer you as best I can. Yeah, so thanks for tuning in, and we'll be back at you with another episode of us continuing our playthrough, and we will do it in the format in which we play through the game first, just react to the story, and then dive into the mythology afterwards so that we're not missing any of the kind of important bits of narrative that are coming through. So, all right, thanks so much, and we'll see you next time. Bye.